really quickly before we get into the stories. It was very tough to find all Thanksgiving story themed stories for this episode. I only got 4 of them and permission for 4 of them, even though I sent out at least 20 or 30. So these last 2 stories I used are not themed or have nothing to do with Thanksgiving. And I have to preface this episode with that because I know that there's somebody out there, one of you listening, who's just itching, waiting, chomping at the bits to go, these last 2 stories are not Thanksgiving stories. You know you were going to put it in the comments, so I'm just nipping it in the bud right now. And with all that being said, let's get into the spooky stories. I have a lot of weird, spooky experiences, but this is the one that's taken the cake for me. It was Thanksgiving weekend of 2018, and I spent the weekend at my sister's apartment. We were both living in Chicago and attending college. She lived off campus with a roommate while I lived in the dorms. At the time, my sister was home alone for the holiday weekend, since her roommate left to spend it in Florida. So I spent the weekend with my sister. If you've ever been to Chicago, whether you visited or lived, I'm sure you know how cloudy it can be. That Thanksgiving, it was very gloomy and wet, from the little bit of rain we kept getting. My sister's place was located in a neighborhood that was undergoing gentrification. At the time, there wasn't many people occupying the apartments and houses. The neighborhood was quiet. As soon as you got off the L, you could feel how eerie the place was, but her apartment was much worse. It was a long apartment with 3 bedrooms, a small kitchen, 1 bathroom, and a cute, cozy living room. Not a lot of sunlight could shine into the apartment, so most of the rooms were cold and dark, and the hall leading to the kitchen was winding. When I arrived, I immediately felt off about the kitchen window. The window looked out at the back deck and to the alleyway. At night, there wasn't any source of light on the deck or in the alley, so the window would be completely black. If you peered through the window, you'd only see your reflection. At first, I thought the reason why I felt anxious about the window was because of how dark it was. Whenever I was in the kitchen, I felt someone watching me through it, so I'd never look at it. But the feeling of being watched followed me into the living room. I slept in the living room while my sister slept in her room. Her roommate's dog would stay with me. I would wake up to the little guy laying at the foot of the futon, growling at the hall. I sat up and stared in an attempt to see what was spooking him. And that's when I heard the creaking floorboard, as if someone was walking, slowly and heavily, down the hall. I immediately thought that someone was in the apartment. I got up and grabbed the nearest object that I could to use as a weapon. But I'll admit, I was scared shitless. I went down the hall halfway, because there was some small part of me that knew that no one was there, but I wanted to know what I was hearing. I made it to the kitchen and no one was there. The noise had stopped. So I went back to bed. The dog woke me up again with his growling. When I listened, I heard the footsteps coming down the hall once more. Like a flash of a movie scene, I saw in the back of my mind a tall man standing at the foot of the futon. He had a long brown coat, baggy jeans, and heavy shoes. He just stood there, glaring at me, and I could feel how angry he was, how he wanted to kill someone. After the image was gone, I was left with a sense of fear that I could not shake. I stayed up for the rest of the night and told my sister the next day. And that morning, she had taken the dog out to pee, and I stayed inside to move the futon and fold the blankets. When she left, she shut the back door and the glass door that was behind it. Both doors were secured, so I went to the living room to straighten up, and I heard the back door open and then the glass door, but I didn't hear a dog. I walked down the hall back to the kitchen and I found both doors open. I went to the window and looked out, and my sister was all the way down the alley with the dog. I shut the doors and I turned around to look at the camera that my sister's roommate had on the fridge. The 2 doors opening on their own were caught on it. When my sister returned, I told her, and she told me about a story her roommate told her. Her roommate lived at the apartment before my sister had moved in. and she told my sister that there was a man who had been shot by the police, and he took off running to the apartment because he used to live there. He hadn't lived there in some time and wasn't aware that someone was actually occupying the space. So when he tried to enter the apartment, he couldn't get the door open. He ended up dying in the doorway. I don't really know if the story was true, but I never looked it up. But it aligned with what was going on while I was there. Later that night, my sister camped out in the living room with me and the dog. She was on the couch sleeping and I was on the futon. I was startled awake when someone hit me in the head with one of those pillows with the big ass button sewn in the middle. The button hit my temple and it really hurt. I sat up, I was pissed, and I looked at my sister. She was dead asleep on her stomach with her arms tucked under her chest. There was no way she could have laid back down without me hearing or seeing her. The pillow that hit me was on the futon next to me. The next morning I had a bruise. And it was the last day of the holiday weekend and I decided to go home that afternoon. I had had enough of whatever was there. I was both annoyed and scared. I hadn't experienced that before and I don't really know what to make of it. I grew up in a suburb of Raleigh, North Carolina that has a virtually non-existent crime rate. My father and I moved down there when I was 6. He was always very busy, so I pretty much had to raise myself. So naturally, I attended school there, and that's where I made my lifelong relationships, so on and so forth. In 2008, I was a senior in high school. I had a very close-knit group of friends, primarily composed of people I had known since middle school. One such friend had just recently come back from Holly Hill, which was our local mental hospital, after a suicide attempt. Matt had been gone for a couple of weeks. I saw him in the courtyard before heading to class. Unfortunately, I didn't really have time to talk, so all I had said to him was, "Welcome back, man. I missed you." I would have risked being late to class if I had known that would be the last thing I would ever say to him. Matt had suffered from depression and dementia for years, but he kept a pretty good rap on the details, so none of his friends really had any inkling of how severe it actually was, until the aforementioned suicide attempt. We got out of school for Thanksgiving break, and one of our mutual friends messaged me on Facebook and asked if I'd like to go paintballing with him on the night of the 30th. Unfortunately, I had to turn them down because I had to go see my grandparents the next morning for a late Thanksgiving celebration. It wasn't a big deal, just kind of a disappointment. Break came and went, and we went back to school. Matt was absent. There had been a rumor floating around that he had run away and gone to Washington, D.C. to look for his birth mother. I wasn't really sure if I believed that, especially that he would gone off on this long-term trip without at least mentioning it to me first. In between switching classes, I called his cell phone to find it off, but didn't think anything of it. A few days later, during lunchtime, there was a buzz around the school that Allegra, our mutual friend from earlier, and Adel, someone else who I was more acquaintances with than friends, but knew of him, had been taken out of class and arrested. We had no idea what happened, but I had a strange feeling that it had something to do with Matt's absence. After that, all I could really think about was where Matt was, and the fact that Allegra sat right behind me in Shakespeare class, and that she was so tired that she slept through class the day we came back from break. The school tried to keep everything quiet in regards to students theorizing and talking to one another. But it was high school, and word travels fast. When we weren't talking, we were texting one another about it. Our local news website reported in an article that 4 of Matt's friends had been arrested in connection with a body found in Allegra's parents' summer home. And you guessed who it was. It was Matt. 2 years after, Allegra, Adel, and 2 other people from Matt's circle of friends went on trial. Allegra received 2 consecutive 20 years for the conspiracy to commit murder and murder in the 2nd degree. Adel received the same. The 2 others in the trial received a life sentence for 1st-degree murder and accessory after the fact due to 1st-degree murder. I watched the trial unfold. All of the trial is available online as well if anyone wanted to learn about it. There's a lot more details than I could post here without boring everyone. But you should be able to type in some details into Google and find the story. They killed him on the night of November 30th, the night they asked me to come paintballing with them. There was a period of time where I kicked myself for not going that night. I like to think that I would have some, if a little, influence in stopping them. So, to the people I thought I knew, and thought were friends to myself and Matt, let's not ever meet again. Okay, so I believe I might have posted this a few years ago, shortly after it happened. And I'm writing again because I recently was on a call with my mother, and without prompting, she brought it up. The story is about 5 years old now, give or take a few months. For a while, I thought I might have dreamed it or something, but my mom corroborated my story. I was 18 at the time. It was my first Thanksgiving that I wasn't in school. My mom and I were taking our usual 7-hour trip up north on holidays like this. It was more like 9 hours to our family in New Jersey for the holiday. We used to live up there, and since moving down south, we made and still make the trip up north about 4 or 5 times a year. Needless to say, we are abundantly familiar with the interstate. We're abundantly familiar with the entire route, to be honest. The way we always go is taking Route 64 to 295 before getting onto the interstate. The beautiful I-95. It sucks. It's always filled with traffic. So naturally the two of us leave at ungodly hours in the morning. This really doesn't bother either of us, because we both wake up early anyway. So this trip started off like any other. We were out the door by 6:15, had our Chick-fil-A in hand by 6:30. And we're filled up on gas and on the road by 7 or so. The first part of the trip was fine. We put on music, talked about random stuff, and gossiped like mothers and daughters do. And by the time we got to the 295 exit, it was still fairly early. But both of us were wide awake. She took the exit and we were set. The road looked as it always did. Nothing was out of the ordinary. After a few minutes of driving though, something felt very wrong. Gone were the multiple lanes of the highway. We were now what looked to be on a country road. It cut through a cornfield and only had one lane of traffic in either direction. We were, as far as either of us could see, the only ones driving on that stretch of road. There was a little farmhouse on our right side, but that's about all. My mom and I were both really taken aback because we'd just been on the highway. Neither of us had noticed any exits, nor had my mom gotten off at the wrong one. We'd been on 295 and then suddenly we weren't. My mom tried to rationalize it at first, saying that she probably wasn't paying attention and she had a bit of a headache forming and had just gotten off the wrong exit. At the time I agreed with her, but something felt very, very off again. And suddenly, that Chick-fil-A breakfast wasn't sitting so well anymore. There weren't any signs for directions, only a few speed limit signs as we kept going. When I looked at the dashboard clock too, only a minute or so had gone by. By the looks of it, we were in the middle of nowhere, Virginia, and time to me didn't seem to match up, but I just felt weird and dizzy at that point. My mom decided to keep driving forward. I don't know why, she just didn't K-turn so we could go back. But she's always been the one to prefer to get actual directions. We didn't have cell service either, so that may have been why. It's pretty normal for rural Virginia though. I work on a haunted farm during Halloween season, so I'm pretty used to spotty reception. We kept driving, and after maybe 15 minutes we came to what I guess was the census design place's idea of a town. And by this I mean there was a service station and a church. We stopped the car. They filled us up, and my mom asked for directions. The guys were pretty nice, your typical laid-back Southerners. They did tease my mom, however, for her New York accent, though. We explained that we'd gotten turned around after coming off 295, and they looked really surprised. The younger of the two guys said that coming from the direction we had, we were driving towards 295 north, not away from it. And that really threw us for a loop. They asked if we'd ever done this trip before, if we were new to Virginia or something. And were very shocked when we said yes. We all got quiet after that. And my mom and I got back into the car and drove another 20 minutes to get back to the highway. Once we were back en route, That pit in my stomach went away. Neither of us really talked anymore about it. We did mention it to our families once we got to New Jersey. I've thought about this experience a lot since it happened, though I tried to rationalize it. But the more I think about it, the weirder it gets. Sure, plenty of people make driving mistakes when they're tired, but my mom and I both had our coffee well before this had happened. What really trips me up is how we were driving toward 295 and not away from it. How far away from the exit were we on that country road? That and how little time had passed between being on the interstate and not being on the interstate. Like I said, I thought maybe I just dreamt it. I was on the phone with my mom yesterday though, and she brought it up out of nowhere. I guess she was thinking about it because we were trying to decide what to do for Thanksgiving. She asked if I remembered that time we teleported, which is a very funny way to start out a conversation. But then she got serious and said it actually freaked her out. She recounted the events almost exactly how I did, except she did say there was a sign along the country road pointing towards the service station. Regardless of what actually happened, it was a bizarre and jarring experience. At least it taught me to always appreciate friendly gas station employees. This is a story that my mother and aunts told me when I was in high school. I'm 21 now, and it's never left me. I think about it constantly and ponder over what happened. My grandfather passed close to a year ago in June of 2020. He was 96 when he died, and it caused some issues within my family. They don't really pertain to the story, but there are some things about him that I have to share in order to explain the story in the best way possible. My grandfather, John, was a man who was extremely calloused and old-fashioned. He was bitter, abusive, and a complete macho man. My mother was raised on never showing emotion or pain due to his abuse and lack of compassion for others. He was also an extreme racist. He had many secrets in my family that are now coming to light after his death. Everything that happened around him was brushed off and forgotten because he had more important things to do, like drinking and having affairs. Just an overall intense and very no-nonsense type of man. He was not religious at all and found things like faith and hope stupid. This story takes place sometime in the 70s, most likely early to mid-70s. My mom was born in 1965 and remembers the story clearly. My aunts as well remember this happening, but no one knows exactly what year. One day, John decided to take his family on a small outing to the intent of having a picnic in the woods. My mother and her 3 sisters and her mother, my grandmother, were all there and very excited about this. From where we are from, my family is way more accustomed to the woods and has lived in this area for generations. Going into the woods for a fun family activity was nothing out of the ordinary and seemed to be just another normal day. They made their way back down a dirt road and stopped once they found a clearing large enough to accommodate them. As all the kids started jumping out of the car and messing around as kids do after being stuck together, my grandmother began unloading their food and picnic supplies. John began surveying the area and deciding where to set up at. As he was doing that, something in the woods past the clearing caught his eye. Before going to see what was out there, he yelled to the family and said he would be right back. The kids and my grandmother didn't think much of this, since they were all used to the woods, and these woods in particular, they were all very familiar with. They continued unloading and setting things up that they brought. One of the girls pointed out something in the clearing that caused a sudden shift, from a normal day to something far worse. It was a dirt mound, and it looked like something was buried in it. The mound itself was about the size of a small person, maybe even child-sized. It was too big to simply be an animal in the woods. There was nothing but squirrels and raccoons in this area. Scattered amongst the mound were large river rocks, and there was no pattern, but they were definitely placed on the mound intentionally. Also, the dirt seemed to be very fresh, as though it was just buried. It was loose and slightly darker than the area around it. The mood immediately shifted from an average day in the woods to something much darker. My grandmother became concerned and told the girls to stay away from it. She was clearly upset and worried about it, but did her best to just ignore it. And the girls, all being children, didn't have the same amount of worry and continued playing while just avoiding the mound. They tried to return to their picnic, and the girls were already chasing one another in circles again. It was supposed to be a joyous sunny day, and my grandmother wanted to keep it that way. Things seemed to return to normal for just a beat. The trees around them created a wall of dense foliage, blocking their view from anything inside the forest. One of the girls again took notice of something strange. It was clear immediately what it was. Along one of the long branches of a tree hung a noose. It was tied with rope and hung high above their heads. A lump of dirt can be explained away by nature, but someone had to have placed that noose there. My grandmother stopped dead in her tracks when she first saw it. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. They couldn't just pack up and leave. John was still out in the woods. Even children can recognize a noose as a symbol of death. The children started to become very anxious. Whatever innocence was keeping them from worrying about the mound had now completely vanished. My grandmother, the resilient woman she is, soothed her children and told them it was just left by deer hunters. But she knew in her heart they needed to leave. No deer hunter would hang a deer and then bury it. At least no sane deer hunter. It wasn't until they started hearing something in the woods that they began to really panic. My grandmother as well as the children all began hearing a rhythmic chanting from deep within the woods. It sounded as though there was a group of people all singing in deep voices to the beat of a drum. It went in a quick bump 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 pattern. 3 steady beats followed by a pause, then it would repeat. It sounded far away, but immediately fear began to take hold of each of them. They each listened and gathered together. As the seconds passed, it began to increase in volume. It was not just getting louder, but closer. What started out as a distant echo soon began to engulf the entire clearing. My grandmother was terrified and wanted so desperately to leave, but John had yet to return. So they waited, fear-ridden, as the sound began to fill their chests. It felt like they were at a concert as the deep bass began to vibrate inside their chest. It was everywhere and constant, as though the sound was being made by the tree themselves, surrounding the family in every direction. Suddenly, the sound of yelling broke through the constant drone of chanting. John's voice was yelling out to them from the trees. "Go!" he yelled. "Get in the car!" He came running out of the woods, yelling that they needed to leave. They had never seen terror on this man as they had in this moment. He was a man afraid of nothing, unbothered by the world around him, and this was the most emotion any of them had ever seen from him. He saw something in those woods, something that shook his very being to the core. My grandmother began throwing everything back inside the car as the kids got in as well. John and my grandmother picked up their things and as quickly as possible threw them all to the car as well. They had no care for the things they were packing up due to their fear. Food was all over the trunk. Items were broken. After everything was tossed in, they both got in the car and drove away quickly. This is where the main part of the story ends. But one fact from the story is what really caused me to wonder all these years. My grandfather has refused to ever speak of what he saw that day. He never told any of the children nor my grandmother. Every time this was brought up, he quickly would rebuff it and angrily told them not to ask again. He never went to the police or told anyone outside the family. My grandfather is the only person who knows what happened that day. When I first heard the story, I swore to myself I would ask him. Now I can't, and I regret it greatly. By the time I was in high school, he had moved out of state with other family members, and I mostly lost contact with him, outside of the occasional happy birthday calls or letters. Unfortunately, this story doesn't have an answer to go with it. When he died, the only thing I was sad about was never knowing what happened that day. We were never close, and when I got older, I learned about all the abuse he used to cause, so I separated myself from him. His death looms over me, and this story still haunts me to this day. My mother and aunts just look back at it as a spooky memory from their childhood. Nothing more than a story to spook the little ones on Thanksgiving with. I'm one of the only people in the family who is still curious what happened. I've always been interested in mysteries, the occult, horror, and conspiracy theories. And this story piqued my interest more than any other in my family. Which, by the way, isn't the only strange story from my family, but it's definitely the most strange out of all of them. I wish I had answers. I hope you all find this story as fascinating as I do. This happened 4 years ago at my then girlfriend's house. She lives in the sticks of North Carolina with the neighbors on either side about a half a mile away. Her parents and older brother were home. And for context, we were both 15 at the time. It was around 11 p.m. on a Saturday, and a car pulled up in the driveway. The headlights shone through my girlfriend's bedroom window, and then we heard a car door shut. My girlfriend and I figured it was a family friend or someone who was coming to hang out and drink with their parents, so we didn't pay it much mind. About 10 minutes later, my ex's father comes into the room looking frantic. He tells us to lock the windows and grabbed her gun just to be safe. He walked out of the front door and we sat with her mom and brother in the kitchen. Her dad came out maybe 2 minutes later, walked into his bedroom and comes out with a handgun and then walks out the front door again. We had no idea what was going on, but we soon heard her dad yelling and then walked back inside saying he took care of the situation. He told us that there was a car parked in the driveway with the headlights off and a person inside the driver's seat. He said that he reached for the door handle, but the person looked up and whipped it in reverse right out of their driveway. However, he thought there was still someone in the woods because of the car door we heard. So we walked back outside with the flashlight and that gun. When he came back in, he told us to lock everything and for all of us to stay in one room. He said that as he was walking around the house, he shone his flashlight into the woods, and there was a trail of reflectors that were stuck to trees leading from the road to their house. They were screwed into the trees, so this was definitely premeditated. He fired his gun a few times to hopefully scare them away. Thankfully, nothing else happened, but it was a nerve-wracking experience nonetheless. Was this someone planning on robbing us, murdering us? I have no idea, but I'm glad we didn't have to find out. We all sat and slept in the living room together, and I left the next day. When I was about 10 or 11 years old, I shared a room with my older brother who was around 15. We live in the suburb area of New York. Not the greatest area, but not riddled with crime. There are 2 windows in my room, one that overlooks the backyard and one that connects to the front porch. It came in quite handy for my brother to sneak out and meet with friends. If you step out into the window, you are on the porch, so anyone on the porch can access this window. I was never really bothered by that thought, because quite honestly, it had never crossed my mind. My bed was touching this window, while my brother's bed was perpendicular to mine. It was an odd setup, but that's besides the point. Now, this was before we had any sort of smartphone or laptop to keep ourselves occupied. So on nights when we weren't sleepy, we would just stay up talking to one another, making up dumb games to pass the time. This event took place during the summer. We had stayed up late into the hours of the night. Perks of having no school. It was probably around 2 a.m. and eventually we were playing a game where one of us was a goalkeeper and the other was taking a shot. We both would say at the same time, either left, center, or right. If the goalkeeper guessed the same as the one taking the shot, he would get a point. And if the other person taking the shot said a position that the other goalie said, then they got a point. We went for a couple of rounds, and I was beating his ass at this, even though that's irrelevant. I don't remember what round we were on, but we did our 3, 2, 1 countdown. And my brother, the goalkeeper, said left. I, the shooter, said center. And then a voice from outside on the porch window said, left. My brother and I froze. We had the shade down, but my mom had left the porch light on, so that was the only light illuminating our room, the dim porch light coming in from the borders of the shade. At the time, in my house was my mother on the opposite side of the window, my sister the room over, and my dad in the basement. and then me and my brother, shitting our pants practically. We waited for what seemed like an hour, but was probably only 30 to 45 seconds. And we heard a giggle and a playful knock at the window. "Let's go another round. Come on, boys," the voice said, but in a cheerful, playful tone. Honestly, I want to say it was a scary voice and sounded menacing, but it didn't. It sounded like a woman, not too old but young. It was just normal. Just like a normal sounding voice. Nothing off about it besides the fact that where it was coming from and the time it came. Me and my brother were seriously freaked out. And I was about to break down because how close I was to this woman. The thought that all I had to do was lift the shade and I'd be face to face with this person scared the shit out of me. It made me go as still and stiff as if I just looked into Medusa's eyes. After a while, me and my brother not responding, my brother started slowly moving from his bed to the door, as not to make any noise. As my brother was tiptoeing towards the door, the sound of nails being ran down a window started. It started very slow, from the top to the bottom. At that point, my brother made it to the door. He looked back at me and brought his fingers to his lips, gesturing for me to keep quiet. Once those nails stopped running down my window, I heard her light footsteps make their way off the porch and then disappear into the night. I laid there for an eternity, not moving until my brother returned. And I saw my mom move hastily by my door, making her way to the front door. The porch light flipped on, and I was left in darkness with my brother, waiting in the doorway for my mom's return. I heard my mom call my dad up the stairs and his groggy, annoyed footsteps coming up. They talked, then came into me and my brother's room, and we relayed what happened. Apparently, my mom caught sight of that lady turning out of our driveway, behind some of the tall bushes, and thank God we had a long driveway. Otherwise, my mom probably would have thought we were just crazy. Considering no harm was done besides leaving me terrified at my window, my parents didn't call the police. They just thought it was really weird and stayed up the rest of the night to make sure she didn't return. I'm now 17. My brother is in college, so I have the room to myself. My bed still touches that window because I'm too lazy to move the rest of the furniture in my room so I can move my bed. That shade to that window has not been opened since that incident, and it probably never will be. Hey everyone, thanks for listening if you stuck around to this point. If you haven't yet, please hit the like button, the subscribe button, and that notification bell to be notified when future episodes come out. If you have a true scary story of your own, feel free to send it to my email or post it to my subreddit. You can stalk me on Twitter, you can stalk me on Facebook, and you can also stalk me on Instagram. All these links are below. Hey, what's up everybody? I know this one's a little shorter than I wanted it to be, but there is a shortage, or at least I couldn't find too many Thanksgiving stories, at least specific Thanksgiving stories. So hopefully this is enough. Hopefully you got your fix, and hopefully every single one of you has a great Thanksgiving. Eat some food, drink some drinks, spend time with your friends, your family, your loved ones, whatever, or spend time with yourself. Whatever you do and whatever your traditions are, I hope you guys have a really great one. And I will see you in the next one. Cheers. Gobble gobble.